The Egyptian armed forces are the military forces of Egypt and are one of the largest in Africa, the Middle East, and the world. They consist of the Army, Navy, Air Force and Air Defense Forces. The Supreme Commander of the Armed Forces is the President of the Republic as provided for in the Egyptian Constitution. The Supreme Council of the Armed Forces consists of 23 to 25 members, headed by the Commander-in-Chief and Defense Minister and his deputy, the Chief of Staff of the Armed Forces. Members of the Council are formed of the leaders of the 5 main military branches, the 2nd and 3rd Army commanders, the military region commanders, along with the heads of the upper bodies, administrative managers and the Assistant Defense Secretary for Constitutional and Legal Affairs and Secretary General of the Department of Defense. The modern Egyptian armed forces have fought several major wars since independence, from the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, Egyptian Revolution of 1952, Suez Crisis, North Yemen Civil War, Six-Day War, Nigerian Civil War, War of Attrition, Yom Kippur War, Egyptian Bread Riots, 1986 Egyptian Conscripts Riot, Libyan-Egyptian War, Gulf War, War on Terror, Egyptian Crisis, Second Libyan Civil War, War on ISIL and the Sinai Insurgency. The equipment of the modern Egyptian army comes from several countries, including the United States, Russia, France, Italy, Ukraine, China, as well as locally from the Arab Organization for Industrialization, National Service Products Organization, Eagles International for Defense Systems, Egyptian Atomic Energy Authority and the Ministry of Military Production. The internal political power of the Egyptian armed forces since the Arab Spring has caused it to be called a state within a state. History. Egypt is an ancient country, making it necessary to configure an army to keep the structure of the state and its survival. Ancient Egyptian army military forces first formed by the pharaohs. The Egyptian army is one of the oldest armies of the Middle East and Africa. First formation of the Egyptian army was in the era of King Narmer, the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt. Most of the pharaohs of warheads leaders such as King Ahmose I, who free Egypt from the Hyksos occupation of Upper Egypt and the reunification of the country, and feet became an army of extreme importance, especially in the era of the modern state. King Thutmose III, who was able to configure the first Egyptian empire, and King Ramses II, who repelled the Hittites' attacks and held their first registered a peace treaty in human history. The rule of Muhammad Ali. Yet modern Egypt and its armed forces were the creation of Muhammad Ali. Following Muhammad Ali's seizure of power in Egypt and declaration of himself as Khedive of the country, Muhammad Ali Pasha set about establishing a bona fide Egyptian military. Prior to his rule, Egypt had been governed by the Ottoman Empire, and while he still technically owed the empire fealty, Muhammad Ali sought to gain full independence for Egypt. To further this aim, he brought in European weapons and expertise, and built an army that defeated the Ottoman Sultan, wresting control from the port of the Levant and Hejaz. The Egyptian army was involved in the following wars during Muhammad Ali's reign: Greek War of Independence, Egyptian-Ottoman War, Egyptian-Ottoman War. In addition, he used his army to conquer Sudan and unite it with Egypt. Egypt was involved in the long-running 1881–99 Mahdist War in the Sudan, making of a professional army during Muhammad Ali Pasha's reign. The Egyptian army became a much more strictly regimented and professional army. The recruits were separated from daily civilian life and a sense of the impersonal of law was imposed. The new recruits were also drawn from the Egyptian farmers, not from Sudanese slaves or Mamluks. In previous times, the wives and family were allowed to follow the army as they were camped out. This was no longer the case. Isolating the recruits in barracks, military schools and training camps was the first essential step towards the creation of the professional, disciplined force of soldiers. Inside these barracks, soldiers were also subjected to new practices. The rules and regulations were not made to inflict punishment on the recruits but rather to impose a sense of respect for the law. The threat of punishment was enough to keep them in line and from deserting. The roll call was taken twice a day, and those found missing would be declared deserters and would have to face the punishment for their actions. Passing laws with a strict punishment regime was not sufficient for the soldiers to internalize the different army regulations that they were asked to obey. For this to succeed, these soldiers had to be interned and isolated from outside influences. They then had to be taught to follow rules and regulations that came with army life. This process helped to transform the fellow into disciplined soldiers. Before the Second World War, military service was compulsory for men between the ages of 19 and 27. But because of the limited size of the army, about 23,000 in 1939, few were actually conscripted. Britain maintained a strong influence and provided the Army and Air Force with equipment, instruction, and technicians. In September 1939, the Egyptian army was mobilized and dispatched to man various defenses, including beginning patrols along the western border with Italian Libya. Leaving border patrols to the Egyptian army initially was a calculated attempt by the British to minimize tension with Italy. During the war, Egypt's army grew to about 100,000 troops. After the Egyptian Revolution of 1952, after the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, a revolutionary organization was created secretly by the Egyptian officers under the name of Free Officers. The Free Officers, led by Muhammad Naguib and Gamal Abdel Nasser, overthrew King Farouk in the Egyptian Revolution of 1952. The Free Officers then forced the remaining British troops based in the Suez Canal to leave Egypt. In 1954, in the early 1950s, politics rather than military competence was the main criterion for promotion. The Egyptian commander, Field Marshal Abdel Hakim Amer, was a purely political appointee who owed his position to his close friendship with Nasser, a inept, corrupt, and a heavy drinker. He would prove himself grossly incompetent as a general during the Suez Crisis. Rigid lines between officers and men in the Egyptian army led to a mutual mistrust and contempt between officers and the men who served under them. Soros writes that the Israelis seized and held the initiative throughout the campaign and quickly destroyed the Egyptian defenses. Quote, "In a few instances, such as at the Mitla Pass and Abu Aguilia, Egyptian defenses were well organized and stubbornly held, but this did not make enough difference overall." Nasser ordered a retreat from the Sinai, which allowed the Israelis to wreak havoc and drive on the canal. On the 5th of November, British and French parachute landings began in the canal zone, but by the 7th of November U.S. pressure had forced an end to the fighting. North Yemen Civil War. The armed forces fought in the North Yemen Civil War from 1962 to 1967. Within 3 months of sending troops to Yemen in 1962, Nasser realized that the operation would require a larger commitment than anticipated. By early 1963, he would begin a 4-year quest to extricate Egyptian forces from Yemen, using an unsuccessful face-saving mechanism, only to find himself committing more troops. A little less than 5,000 troops were sent in October 1962. 2 months later, Egypt had 15,000 regular troops deployed. By late 1963, the number was increased to 36,000, and in late 1964, the number rose to 50,000 Egyptian troops in Yemen. Late 1965 represented the high watermark of Egyptian troop commitment in Yemen at 55,000 troops, which were broken into 13 infantry regiments of 1 artillery division, 1 tank division and several special forces as well as airborne regiments. All the Egyptian field commanders complained of a total lack of topographical maps, causing a real problem in the first months of the war. Six-Day War. Before the June 1967 war, the army divided its personnel into 4 regional commands. The remainder of Egypt's territory, over 75%, was the sole responsibility of the Frontier Corps. In May 1967, Nasser closed the Straits of Tarin to passage of Israeli ships. Israel considered the closure of the straits deadly serious, and prepared their armed forces to attack. On June 3, 3 battalions of Egyptian commandos were flown to Amman to take part in operations from Jordan. But U.S. historian Trevor N. Dupuy, writing in 1978, argues from King Hussein of Jordan's memoirs that Nasser did not intend to start an immediate war, but instead was happy with his rhetorical and political accomplishments of the past weeks. Nevertheless, Israel felt they needed to take action. The Egyptian army now comprised 2 armored and 5 infantry divisions, all deployed in the Sinai. In the weeks before Six-Day War began, Egypt made several significant changes to its military organization. Field Marshal Amer created a new command interposed between the General Staff and the Eastern Military District Commander, Lieutenant General Salah ad-Din Muhsin. This new Sinai Front Command was placed under General Abdul Mohsen Murtaghi, who had returned from Yemen in May 1967. 6 of the 7 divisions in the Sinai had the commanders and chiefs of staff replaced. What fragmentary information is available suggests to authors such as Pollock that Amer was trying to improve the competence of the force, replacing political appointees with veterans of the Yemen War. After the war began on 5 June 1967, Israel attacked Egypt, destroyed its air force on the ground, and occupied the Sinai Peninsula. The forward-deployed Egyptian forces were shattered in 3 places by the attacking Israelis. Field Marshal Amer, overwhelmed by events, and ignoring previous plans, ordered a retreat by the Egyptian army to the Suez Canal. This developed into a rout as the Israelis harried the retreating troops from the ground and from the air. Arab Republic of Egypt. After the 1967 debacle, the army was reorganized into 2 field armies, the 2nd Army and the 3rd Army, both of which were stationed in the eastern part of the country. The 1969–1970 War of Attrition served to prepare Egypt for the next conflict. The October War of 1973 began with Operation Badr, a massive and successful crossing of the Suez Canal. Casualties were relatively light. Dupuy cites Egyptian reports of under 200 killed. The Syrians coordinated their attack on the Golan Heights to coincide with the Egyptian offensive and initially made threatening gains into Israeli-held territory. As Egyptian President Anwar Sadat began to worry about Syria's fortunes, he believed that capturing 2 strategic mountain passes located deeper in the Sinai would make his position stronger during the negotiations. The Egyptians went back on the offensive on the 14th of October, but the attack attack was quickly repulsed. The Israelis then counterattacked at the juncture of the Second and Third Armies, crossed the Suez Canal into Egypt, and began slowly advancing southward and westward in over a week of heavy fighting which inflicted heavy casualties on both sides. On the 22nd of October, a United Nations brokered ceasefire quickly unraveled, with each side blaming the other for the breach. By the 24th of October, the Israelis had improved their positions considerably and completed their encirclement of the Third Army and the city of Suez. This development led to tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union. As a result, a second ceasefire was imposed cooperatively on the 25th of October to end the war. At the conclusion of hostilities, Israeli forces were just 40 kilometers from Damascus and 101 kilometers from Cairo. Egypt claimed victory in the Yom Kippur War because its military objective of capturing a foothold of Sinai was achieved. After 1973, the army fought in the 1977 Libyan-Egyptian War. The army had an estimated strength of 320,000 in 1989. About 180,000 of these were conscripts. Beyond the Second Army and Third Army in the east, most of the remaining troops were stationed in the Nile Delta region, around the Upper Nile, and along the Libyan border. These troops were organized into 8 military districts. Commando and airborne units were stationed near Cairo under central control but could be transferred quickly to one of the field armies if needed. District commanders, who generally held the rank of Major General, maintained liaison with governors and other civil authorities on matters of domestic security. Decision-making in the army continued to be highly centralized during the 1980s. Officers below brigade level rarely made tactical decisions and required the approval of higher-ranking authorities before they modified any operations. Senior army officers were aware of this situation and began taking steps to encourage initiative at the lower levels of command. A shortage of well-trained enlisted personnel became a serious problem for the army as it adopted increasingly complex weapons systems. Observers estimated in 1986 that 75% of all conscripts were illiterate when they entered the military. The army was used to suppress the 1986 Egyptian conscripts riot. Since the 1980s, the army has built closer and closer ties with the United States, as evidenced in the biannual Operation Bright Star exercises. This cooperation eased integration of the Egyptian army into the Gulf War coalition of 1990-91, during which the Egyptian Second Corps under Maj. Gen. Salah Mohammed Atta Halabi, with 3rd Mechanized Division and 4th Armored Division, fought as part of the Arab Joint Forces Command North. Halabi had been transferred from command of the Presidential Guard after the initial commander, General Ahmed Bilal, was recalled by Mubarak before the war started because of differences with the Saudi generals. The army conducted Exercise Badr 96 in 1996 in the Sinai. The exercises in the Sinai were part of a larger exercise that involved 35,000 men in total. 21st Century and Revolution. In January 2011, a delegation led by the Chief of Staff of Egypt's Armed Forces, Lt. Gen. Sami Hafizenan, was in Washington, D.C., although the visit was truncated due to the protests. The sessions, an annual country-to-country military coordination, were being led for the U.S. by Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs Alexander Vershbow. A meeting with ADM Mike Mullen, chairman of the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff, and other talks had been planned to extend to the 2nd of February. However, in light of events in Egypt, the delegation left Washington to return home. Before the Friday night departure, Vershbow urged the 24 Egyptian military representatives to exercise restraint. On the 31st of January 2011, during the Egyptian Revolution of 2011, Israeli media reported that the 9th, 2nd, and 7th Divisions of the army had been ordered into Cairo to help restore order. The Supreme Council of the Armed Forces was convened during the course of the Egyptian Revolution of 2011, and assumed power when Mubarak resigned on the 11th of February 2011. On Sunday, the 12th of August 2012, newly elected President Mohamed Morsi announced a series of military appointments. Hussein Tantawi, the Minister of Defense and Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces, was retired. Morsi also retired Sami Anan, the Army's Chief of Staff. Morsi awarded both men state medals and appointed them as advisors to the president. Thirdly, the president appointed the head of military intelligence Abdel Fattah el-Sisi as Minister of Defense to replace Tantawi. Setki Sobhi, the commander of the Third Army, was appointed as Chief of Staff of the Armed Forces. Morsi also retired the commander of the Navy, Mohab Memish, and appointed him as head of the Suez Canal Authority. On the 3rd of July 2013, in response to millions of Egyptians' demands demonstrating in streets all over Egypt since the 30th of June 2013, the head of the Egyptian Armed Forces, then Colonel General Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, announced the removal of President Mohamed Morsi from power, the suspension of the constitution and new presidential and House of Representatives elections, the severe crackdown on the Muslim Brotherhood and pro-Morsi supporters commenced. Incidents such as the 2013 Republican Guard headquarters clashes and the August 2013 RABAA massacre claimed the lives of hundreds to thousands of demonstrators by military and police forces. Politics. The armed forces enjoy considerable power, prestige and independence within the Egyptian state. The first democratically elected president who served for 1 year was removed by a military coup after the June 2013 Egyptian protests throughout Egypt. The Egyptian constitution of 2012 passed under Morsi included protections for the military from legal and parliamentary oversight, and deferred to objections from the country's military leadership by removing a clear prohibition on trials of civilians before military courts. Some drafters had tried to include, starting with the Egyptian Revolution of 1952, which created the Republic of Egypt, organized by the Free Officers Movement. Presidents of Egypt Gamal Abdel Nasser and Anwar Sadat, Hosni Mubarak were ex-military officers for almost 60 years. This was interrupted with 2011 revolution, when President Mubarak was forced to step down by the military in response to the revolution, and the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces ruled until it held a presidential election which resulted in Mohamed Morsi taking office. On the 3rd of July 2013, responding to millions in the streets, the head of the armed forces, then General Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, announced the removal of Morsi and installation of the interim civilian president, the Chief Justice of Supreme Constitutional Court Adli Mansour. On the 4th of July 2013, Mansour was sworn in as acting president. On the 26th of March 2014, el-Sisi resigned from the military, announcing he would stand as a candidate in the 2014 presidential election. He won the 26 to 28 May 2014 election in a landslide. Sisi was sworn into office as President of Egypt on 8 June 2014. The armed forces has its own hospitals, factories, clubs, and gas stations staffed by its officers, soldiers, and civilians. The organization is influential in business circles, engaging in road and housing construction, consumer goods, resort management, and owning extensive tracts of real estate. Much military information is not made publicly available, including budget information, the names of the general officers and the military size. According to journalist Joshua Hammer, as much as 40% of the Egyptian economy is controlled by the Egyptian military. Abel Magd writes that the entrenched economic interests of the military institution provide it with both incentives and resources to uphold political hegemony. The United States provides significant assistance to the Egyptian armed forces. In 2009, the U.S. provided nominal $1.3 billion to the Egyptian military. Egypt is a participant in NATO's Mediterranean Dialogue Forum. Much of the U.S. equipment such as tanks and jet fighters are actually surplus to Egyptian needs and kept in storage. U.S. experts write of the Egyptian military's unwillingness to reorientate itself towards more realistic 21st-century threats. Were the military to proclaim an end to the era of large-scale land battles and to act accordingly, it would call into question its very existence. Preparations for large-scale operations act as a convenient fig leaf to hide the military's inability to adapt, and its primary role in supporting the regime, provide large-scale employment and to generate resources through its business activities. According to Article 200 of the Egyptian Constitution of 2014, the armed forces belong to the people and their duty is to protect the country and preserve its security and the integrity of its territories. Supreme Council of the Armed Forces. In early July 2014, the Egyptian military released a bulletin detailing personnel changes in the armed forces. Two well-established generals were removed from the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces and given new positions. Taher Abdullah, Director of the Engineering Authority, and Saeed Abbas, Commander of the Northern Military Region. Abdullah is now an Assistant Defense Minister, while Abbas is head of the infantry. Neither of these positions warrant a spot on the SCAF. They have been replaced by the deputies, Emad al-Alfi and Mohammed al-Zamilout, respectively. Also, according to reports, Salah al-Badri is now acting Director of Military Intelligence. He previously served as head of security within military intelligence when Abdel Fattah al-Sisi was director. Lieutenant General Osama Raskar retained his seat on the SCAF after being appointed as commander of the new Unified Command for East of the Canal in January 2015. President of Egypt Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, Commander-in-Chief. Colonel General Sedki Sobhi, Commander-in-Chief of the Egyptian Armed Forces and Minister of Defense and Military Production. Lieutenant General Mahmoud Hegazi, Chief of Staff of the Egyptian Armed Forces and Deputy Supreme Commander of the Egyptian Armed Forces. Admiral Osama El-Jendi, Commander-in-Chief of the Egyptian Navy. Air Marshal Yunus Hamd, Commander-in-Chief of the Egyptian Air Force. Lieutenant General Abdelmonem Al-Taraz, Commander-in-Chief of the Egyptian Air Defense Forces. Major General Ismail Atman Ahmed Abu El-Dahab, Director of the Miral and Personnel Affairs Department. Major General Mohsen Al-Fanagri, Assistant Defense Minister and Head of the Organization and Administration Authority. Major General Ahmed Youssef Abdel Nabi, Commander of the Border Guards Force. Major General Mohammed Saber Atta, Director of Military Operations. Major General Mohammed Hegazi, General Officer Commanding of the 2nd Field Army. Major General Hassan al-Rouaini, GOC, Central Military Region. Major General Nabil Mohammed Fahmy, GOC, Northern Military Region. Major General Mohsen El-Shazali, GOC, Southern Region Military. Major General Medhat El-Nafaz, GOC, Western Military Region. Major General Mamdouh Shaheen, Assistant Defense Minister for Constitutional and Legal Affairs. Major General Tayyar Abdullah, Commander of the Armed Forces Engineering Corps. Major General Mohammed El-Assa, Assistant Defense Minister for Armament Affairs. Major General Mokhtar El-Molla, Assistant Defense Minister and Chief of Military Police. Major General Adel Amara, Assistant Defense Minister and Director of Military Intelligence.